Hey everybody, I'm Pastor Joshua Sullivan at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kerrville, Texas. Welcome back to another episode of ATP, Ask the Pastor. Real quick before we get to today's question, if you have something you would like to ask the pastor, email me at atpholycross, that's atpholycross, all one word, at gmail.com, and I will get to your question as soon as I'm able. All right, so let's get to today's question. Someone writes, Dear Pastor, I've heard that Martin Luther wanted to remove certain books from the Bible, Hebrews, James, and Revelation, I believe, but ultimately did not. Can you let us know the motivation for him wanting to do this and why it did not come to pass? All right, Luther did not want to remove books from the Bible. He did, however, question the canonicity of four books, Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation. And he questioned these books based upon their apollisticity and their universality. So by apollisticity, we mean that it was written by an apostle or an apostolic man. For Luther, then, that also means then that the content of the book teaches the apostolic message of Christ. Now, universality, then, means that the church has always, everywhere accepted the book. Now, let's look at authorship first. So in the case of all four books, Luther doubts their apostolic authorship. Hebrews, he believed, was not an epistle of Paul or any other apostle based upon Hebrews 2, verse 3. Jude, he says, speaks of the apostles like a disciple who comes long after them. And while Luther mistakes James for James, the brother of John, rather than James, the brother of Jesus, he does not think the author was an apostle either way. And then Luther shares the doubt of some of the church fathers regarding the authorship of the Apocalypse. He doubts that St. John the Apostle wrote Revelation. Now, in doubting the apostolic authorship of these books, Luther isn't breaking new ground. Luther bases his doubts of Johannine authorship of Revelation on the witness of Eusebius of Caesarea from his ecclesiastical history. In fact, Luther mentions Eusebius, book 3, chapter 25, and he writes, or where Eusebius writes, among the disputed writings, which are nevertheless recognized by many, are extant the so-called Epistle of James, and that of Jude, also that of the second Epistle of Peter, and those that are called the second and third of John, whether they belong to the evangelist or to another person of that name. Now, in the previous chapter, Eusebius wrote, in regard to the Apocalypse, the opinions of most men are still divided. Jerome, he also witnessed to the uncertainty about James' authorship in his work entitled The Lives of Illustrious Men. James, he wrote a single epistle, which is reckoned among the 7 Catholic epistles, and even this is claimed by some to have been published by someone else under his name, and gradually as time went on to have gained authority. So Luther wasn't out of bounds by any means by having doubts about the authorship and the authority of these books. But this begs the question, why was Luther even dealing with issues of canon in the first place? And the answer is that in the late Middle Ages, there was a great amount of uncertainty about what books belonged in the canon, at least on a popular lay level. Johann Michael Roy points out, many medieval manuscripts of the Bible included a 5th gospel, the Gospel of Nicodemus. Many manuscripts and all the printed German Bibles included an additional epistle of St. Paul, the so-called Epistle to the Laodiceans, which is even to be found as late as 1544 in Dietenberger's Roman Catholic translation of the Bible. So with such uncertainty in the air, Luther sought to clarify the New Testament canon as much as he was able based upon the ancient church's witness. Now, besides apostolic authorship, then, apollisticity is also judged by the content of the book. So does the book teach the apostolic message of Christ and the gospel? Luther wrote in his 1522 preface to James and Jude, "For all the scriptures show us Christ," Romans 3:21, and St. Paul will know nothing but Christ, 1 Corinthians 2:2. Whatever does not teach Christ is not yet apostolic, even though St. Peter or St. Paul does the teaching. Again, whatever preaches Christ would be apostolic, even if Judas, Annas, Pilate, and Herod were doing it. So for Luther, the content of the book is just as important as authorship. Now, along with the question of authorship, uh, content then was a contributing factor to Luther's doubts about James, Jude, Revelation, especially. So Luther points out that James doesn't mention Christ's passion and resurrection. It drives people to the law, not to the gospel. Luther also wrote in his original preface that James flatly contradicted St. Paul by attributing justification to works. This is an odd statement for Luther to make because already in his lectures on Romans, which took place from 1515 to 1516, Luther had harmonized James and Paul, and he would continue to do so on other occasions in other writings throughout his life. So that's an odd comment for him to make. He also writes in his 1545 preface, he tries to accomplish by harping on the law what the apostles accomplished by stimulating people to love. Now, this was the basis for Luther's infamous and later retracted Epistle of Straw comment about James. In 1522, he wrote, in a word, St. John's Gospel and his first epistle, St. Paul's epistles, especially Romans, Galatians, and Ephesians, and St. Peter's epistles are the books that show you Christ and teach you all that is necessary and salvatory for you to know, even if you were to never see or hear any other book or doctrine. Therefore, St. James' epistle is really an epistle of straw compared to these others, for it has nothing of the nature of the gospel about it. Now let's make a few comments about this. First, James is only an epistle of straw comparatively, not absolutely. And second, like we mentioned at the beginning of this, Luther retracted this comment. It doesn't appear in editions of Luther's New Testament or his complete Bible after 1537. Now third, Luther also had a lot of good things to say about the Epistle of James, just as he did for all the books whose canonicity he doubted. He wrote in his preface, I praise it, and I consider it good because it sets up no doctrines of men, but vigorously promulgates the law of God. And he added, therefore I cannot include him among the chief books, though I would not thereby prevent anyone from including or extolling him as he pleases, for there are otherwise many good sayings in him. Doesn't sound like he wants to remove him to me. Now, although he was able to harmonize James and Paul, although he preached for him in 1536, and although he favorably cited James in his writings quite often, Luther's doubts about the authorship of James persisted throughout his life, and that's what seems to have kept him away from affirming the book's canonicity. Now, similar things can be said about Luther's opinion of Hebrews, James, and Jude. Hebrews, Jude, and Revelation. We already talked about James. He praised the book of Hebrews and Jude in spite of doubting apostolic authorship. He preached on Jude. He lectured on Hebrews. And while his 1522 preface to the book of Revelation is quite negative, his 1530 preface to Revelation commended the book. And although he still doubted Johannine authorship, he wrote, by that, however, no one should be prevented from regarding this as the work of St. John the Apostle or of whomever else he so chooses. Now, a final point that needs to be made in this, and that's that Luther wasn't alone in his questioning of the canonicity of these books. We've already mentioned the early church's witness to this, but even in Luther's own time, Desiderius Erasmus, a Roman Catholic scholar, was critical of James, Jude, Hebrews, and Revelation. Cardinal Cajetan, one of the leading Roman Catholic scholars of Luther's day, openly accepted Erasmus's conclusion about these four books and didn't think that they were canonical, didn't consider them to be authoritative for deciding doctrine. Cajetan also rejected the canonicity of the Old Testament Apocrypha. Neither of these men were censured by the Roman Church for their view of the canon. Why not? Because the Roman Church had not spoken on the matter yet and wouldn't do so until the Council of Trent. So prior to the Council of Trent, it was perfectly acceptable for any Roman Catholic theologian to doubt the canonicity of certain books. What this means is that in questioning the canonicity of these four books, Luther did no more than some of his Roman contemporaries were doing. So, did Luther want to remove books from the Bible? No. Did he remove books from the Bible? No. All Luther did was question these books' canonicity, which was allowed not only in the ancient church, but also in the Roman church until 1546. Hope this helps. We'll see you next time for another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor.